So, hello everyone, and welcome to the Graduating Podcast. That's right, we finally came up with a name. I know it was very, very difficult. We spent a long time on that one. I'm your host, Ryan, and today, as last time, I have my co host Spencer joining me today.
What's up? How you guys doing?
Welcome, welcome. So, today I'd like to start this episode by going back in time, far, far past COVID, far past social media. We're going to the early 2000s to start off today, because I want to talk about Web 2.0. If you guys don't know what this is the rise of user-generated content on the internet. So things like being able to respond to whatever content you're looking at on the internet, whether it's an article or a news piece. You could leave your own comments or even upload your own videos to websites. And this was huge at the time. It allowed for two-way internet highways, two ways of information on the internet highways. So it's not just, web developers or news companies making content. It was users as well, which is just amazing at the time. So the term Web 2.0 was coined by Danny DiNucci in 1999. I hope I got that name right. And it was popularized by Tim O'Reilly in 2004. With the turn of Web 2.0, that allowed for a lot of, a lot of transferring of, what we already see in the real world coming to the internet or having its own equivalent at least. So things like jokes, comedy, entertainment, of course, the news. And along with that came activism as well. And so it inspired people to make their own organizations, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. So the first one I'd like to bring up is the Youth Justice Coalition, founded by Kim McGill and 60 other people in 2003. Now, this organization is based in Los Angeles, California, and it was centered on assisting former prisoners in telling their stories of injustice and unruly incarcerations. Um, so the fact that there was 60 people that came together to begin with to tell these sorts of stories and say, I've been unfairly imprisoned is pretty big on its own. And the fact that they all came together and agreed to work on something as, a digital project of this caliber is just crazy to think about at the time. Um, so the success of the Youth Justice Coalition sort of inspired similar groups and the allies of the YJC to start their own movements as well and start their own organizations. And the first one I want to bring up is Fierce. Now, Fierce is a Manhattan-based organization, and they created the Fenced Out documentary in order to highlight some of the feelings of loss that the LGBTQ youth of the West Village area in New York City experienced when they were forced away from the Christopher Street Pier, which was a popular meeting point for these youths. So a lot of the ways that the Youth Justice Coalition especially tried to, spread its stories of its, former prisoner members was through video stories. It doesn't explicitly say exactly what these videos were sort of formatted on, but it's interesting they use the word stories because we see that word a lot within social media nowadays. You see that on Snapchat and Instagram, especially. Both those things have stories. It's interesting how there's a sort of equivalent or a link between the two. But they're obviously different. The video stories of back then in 2003 were more like 6 to 7 minute YouTube videos. Or not, sorry, not YouTube videos because YouTube didn't exist back then. My apologies. Just 6 to 7 minute long videos. I imagine they'd be either sent through email or videotapes because that was huge back then. The world sort of the digital world sort of existed in email or on videotapes because that was basically the easiest way to send a video to anybody. You put it on a videotape and you mail it. People used mail back then. It was amazing. And of course, email was an alternative as well. I remember seeing tons and tons of email chains between hundreds of strangers. Those were the sort of chat rooms of the ancient era of the internet. And it's kind of sad that it died out because I quite enjoyed those. Have you ever experienced something like that, Spencer? Something with like a chain of emails or something?
Um, no, but I know back in the day that like forwarding messages was very like influential in getting in spreading like and communicating like a message across. It's my understanding that something sort of similar happened with the Lotus marketplace incident. I think some people like spread emails like letting people know what was going on with this marketplace so consumers could be more understanding of what was happening and more concerned with their privacy and their data. So I know back then, before social media sites have kind of taken over the way we communicate online nowadays, I think back then email and forwarding stuff and spreading stuff through mail and that sort of communication applications and websites was very much the most impactful and most direct way to get a point across.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's sort of the way back then that people sort of got the know about things, you know? Because of course, back then you either had to wait for the news to say something about it or wait for it to show up in the newspaper. And I suppose today's equivalent of that is, hearing about it on Facebook, which of course there's disadvantages to that, There's people who make fictitious articles or spread rumors for the sake of well, baiting people or trolling people. But of course, we'll get into those later in a later episode. Let's keep focusing on the sort of ancient digital activism just for the minute here. I do find it quite a spectacle that some organizations like Fierce and like the Youth Justice Coalition can come together and make this sort of multimedia um, content in order to express whatever messages they can. And it allowed for, at least in the Youth Justice Coalition case, for them to sort of show that prisoners can have their own voices and they don't need professional advocates or lawyers to speak over them. And they took these sort of video stories that they made and the written reports that they made to directly to law enforcement to sort of educate them and say, hey, listen, these are people, they feel like they're not getting a good hand dealt to them. And it's something you need to pay more attention to and consider in your police training. And I want to talk about police training maybe in another episode because I think it's a really interesting topic and it does relate to some of the things we will talk about in later episodes. But don't mind me bagging on about later episodes. You guys will see that when it comes out. Um, and then I want to come back to Fierce as well because I think it was founded by about 11 people, which I guess is a more reasonable number than 60, as we saw with the YJC before, because it's like I don't think anyone really has 60 friends. That's a lot of people. So I think that really helped to get the YJC off the ground because that's a lot of support, 60 people, back then and now especially, since we're all so distant with the pandemic and whatnot. Um, so the 11 people that founded Fierce, one of them was Crystal Portalatin. Sorry if I butchered that name. She was one of the co-founders, and she made a point to say that there's the desire to use more multimedia strategy to, tell stories and make a point and make awareness of things, but not to fund it. And that's a big problem, funding. You really needed a lot of money to, even now, you need a lot of money to get anything off the ground, any project. If it's not funded by a major institution or organization or just any sort of governing body, you're going to obviously struggle to get anywhere. And so that's why a lot of these organizations stayed underground. That's why we don't know a lot about them because they didn't hit the limelight. They just didn't have the money or resources behind them. Um, even in saying that, like the YJC is still around and active today. It's actually aged surprisingly well. I even looked at their website last night, and I'll leave a link to their website somewhere on screen for our YouTube viewers if you want to check that out. It's surprisingly modern and it's easy to navigate. No, it's amazing it's stuck around this long. It must have really gotten the legs to keep going. I'm blown away, Congratulations to them. Um, it's clear from that alone that they've definitely made an impact, and helped these former prisoners really, uh, become activists, that's the most important part about this. So I
How
do
do you
want
Oh,
sorry.
if I could just ask a question, how do you think these like early forms of like activist groups, how do you see them influencing um, digital activist groups today, and how do you think their sort of formula has stuck around?
I think the way they sort of inspire and influence digitally active groups today is the fact that, you know, just their existence alone is a lot to say. Because if that sort of thing can be done back then, before social media existed, before things like change.org existed, back when Google was like still quite archaic, it sort of brings a consideration to mind that anyone can do it. You know,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter what kind of resources you have in front of you as long as you make the best of them. Because of course back then, having like a high quality camera, video editing software, recording software, or just a computer in general was, it was a fairly uncommon thing. So I think we really shouldn't take for granted nowadays the opportunities we have to sit here and do something like a podcast. Like that's a pretty amazing opportunity.
I think that's what a lot of people see as being the value in digital activism. I think it's for its ability to really have a grassroots appeal and just start from the ground up, like like just on like a messaging board or on like Facebook or on Twitter. It can really start from there, and its ability to spread and reach a much wider audience than it would in with less effort and less active work
Mm.
than traditional activist methods. I think that's really the value that people see in it.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely a very sort of intimate and personal nature to it because you're not sitting there and having some authority figure telling you what to say or what to study. You're doing your own project, your own thing, and you're doing it in exactly the way you want to do it. It is difficult, and of course, oh well, I don't agree on the premise that it's it's easy to do. I think the access to do it is very available. It is easy to get into. It's just hard to make it keep going.
Oh, I definitely don't think that it's easy, like per
Right.
se, but I think it's much more accessible than traditional activist methods. Like when you compare actually going out and demonstrating, that requires a lot more like physical effort. You could argue that like activism online is more. There's more effort in other areas. Like you might have to edit things, you might have to like put videos together and put work into those sorts of areas into like communicating messages and spreading it.
Yeah.
But I think when compared to traditional activist methods, it's much more accessible for the average person.
Yeah, I think if you want to become a traditional in-person activist, there's a lot of education I feel like you'd need. It's a very arduous sounding role to play. Whereas if you want to participate in digital acts, all you need is like some sort of device that can connect to the internet, if whether it's a phone or a laptop, a tablet, whatever, and of course an internet connection. That's it. You don't need anything else but that's the bare minimum. But to become an actual real life activist, you need to have experience in communicating, having conducting interviews, event management, project management. The list goes on. You need education for this sort of thing.
Yeah,
um
exactly.
I do want to move on back to the Lotus Marketplace incident that you hinted before, Spencer. This is a very interesting uh, turn of events. This happened back in the 1990s, so we're going even further back in time. But I will warn you, viewers, it's okay. It's the last time we'll be going back in time this episode, all right? That's it. We're just going back to 1990. That's it. So I want to read this article here. It's titled "The Lessons of the Lotus Marketplace: Implications for Consumer Privacy in the 1990s." This was written in 1991, I believe, by Mary J. Coleman. I'll just read a few lines here. On April 10th, 1990, Lotus Development Corporation proudly announced its plans to release the Lotus Marketplace Household. According to the trade press, Marketplace was expected to revolutionize the list industry by making names, addresses, demographic, and prior purchase behavior data for 120 million US consumers available on a CD-ROM. Now, for our younger viewers who don't know what a CD-ROM is, Google it because I don't know either. Um, but no, this is really interesting to read, and it's very scary. I think that this kind of project did take off and was organized by a software company as big as Lotus was. Um, like 120 million US consumers' data just there available on a list. That's pretty similar to what we see nowadays, especially with Facebook. Again, we'll talk about that in a later episode, but it's incredible that this kind of scandal or incident existed even back then. And thank goodness it never thank goodness it did get cancelled. I should mention that. It got cancelled eventually. I will read about that now. So, two features of the Lotus Marketplace were responsible for mobilizing the opposition, which led to its cancellation: the contents of the database and a desktop technology platform. So, essentially, I'll sum this up by saying if you were to sign up to this project or to have this product, you would receive all this data as stated, but you as the end user would then own this data, which means you can distribute it in any way you like and use it in whatever you want. So this could lead to things like fraud, which is very, very scary and terrifying. So thank goodness there was, a mobile opposition that actually stood up and said, this isn't okay. And it's amazing they stood up against, not only Lotus Marketplace, but Equifax as well, which
My,
did.
sorry, my understanding is it was for its time, it was still a very quite large opposition to this. Like there was like a few thousand. I think I think 30,000 if I'm remembering correctly. Do you remember the amount of people that were opposed to this and actively tried to demonstrate against Equifax and Lotus in this like privacy scandal?
I'm not certain. It must have been thousands of people for, both of these, massive bodies to step down and say, oh, we can't let this go ahead. Oh yeah, it does say here more than 30,000 individuals exercise the option to opt out. So there you have it. I will be leaving a link to this archived article in the description of our YouTube video because it is a really interesting read, and it's just amazing to sort of uncover this archaeology of a digital story, an almost digital disaster that nearly happened. And it's amazing that, people did stand up to say, no, I don't want this. And even all the way back then, people were aware of how their data was being used and did not consent to it being spread. It's very
That,
interesting.
that's That's what's most impressive to me because this was 1990. This is in the very
Mm.
like early days of like people being on the internet. The fact that this was able to spread to so many people and so many people became aware of this issue and actively, like went against what was going on and tried to like for the concern of their own like privacy and for the benefit of their own like personal data, like they were actively involved against this. It's very impressive for me to read about like for 1990.
Oh yeah, it's yeah, like I'm speechless, honestly. Like it's staggering something like this could ever happen. Like I never would have imagined it really, because back in 1990, this was still when people were, you know, very sort of mistrusted with computer technology, which may have informed the decision for 30,000 people to come forward and, oppose this. But it's, people were still learning how to use a mouse and keyboard. People were still trying to grasp what's on the screen and just what kind of opportunities were in front of them. The ability to save, store, and transfer data in such a way that you could with computer technology, and surf a virtually infinite digital scape that is the internet. Uh, it's incredible that this kind of data incident was even imaginable back then. Like, and let alone that the fact that it actually happened too. It's like it's almost like a foreshadowing with what's going on with Facebook as well. Like, you can't write this. You can't write this if you tried. It's incredible. But speaking of, user opinions and data, we're going to segue into the next point of this podcast episode here. Spencer has been doing a lot of analysis on a small survey that we conducted I think a few months ago, a few months before the podcast was even thought of. So Spencer, I'll let you take away with some of the finer details of this survey.
Okay, sure. So to just give a background on this survey, it was a survey that was distributed at the end of our first graduating project, like our first class, where we initially came up with this whole like investigation on digital activism and this. We were sort of in the early stages of discussing how we would present our data, and we eventually came to the conclusion of a podcast where we're now discussing like the data we have in front of us. But back then, we decided to distribute a survey, and it had three questions. They weren't multiple choice; they were short answer questions where people would give their own thoughts, beliefs, opinions on digital activism and issues relating to digital activism. So in the end, we had a sample size of 13. It was completely anonymous. No one had to give out their personal details like their name and such when completing this survey. So these are completely anonymous results. And so the first question that was asked was, what does digital activism mean to you? To a lot of people, it meant a lot of different things. But much of the results, there were two kind of common themes that were kind of brought up in the answers to that first prompt.
Yeah.
One of the themes was accessibility. A lot of people stress the accessibility that digital activism, like, that digital media gave activism, and like we were discussing before, with digital media being much more accessible and convenient means of spreading message and engaging in public discourse when compared to traditional forms of activism, like going outside and actively protesting, actively demonstrating against like an issue or something of that nature. So yeah, a lot of people stress the accessibility it gave them, and also the importance it gave to the individual. So on in messaging boards like such as Facebook and Twitter, it was really highlighted how valuable it was in giving more importance to an individual in communicating a message. It may be if you demonstrate it in public, you were just one voice in a crowd, but in
Yeah.
on like a messaging board such as Facebook and Twitter, you're one person whose message can be just as impactful as a celebrity's potentially if it's able to spread to that level. All it takes is one post for it to potentially gain traction online and gain importance to people.
Yeah, oh goodness me, my stutter. I 100% agree with that. There's a lot of sort of virality when it comes to posting on the internet nowadays. It's it's having that virality there, it gives anyone the opportunity to have their posts, their content just explode in popularity. It doesn't matter if they're a celebrity or not. And you often have these cases where random people just own celebrities. Like if a celebrity messes up and tweets something that they shouldn't have, or if they uh, give an incredibly bad take on something, someone can just come along and say, "Oh, this sucks," and then gets a million likes. I know it's a very arbitrary example, but before we move on to the next question, I do want to highlight one response here to this first question. Again, that being, what does digital activism mean to you? There was a response here on the 28th of June. I hate it. All the SJWs stir up hate for their personal gain. It's like this person has wanted to vent that for the longest time, and I feel like this response isn't even close to what the question is. It's just like we're asking what digital activism means to this person, and they're just saying, "Oh, I don't like it." So you're not gonna ever know what I think of the meaning of it. It's just kind of like a metaphorical middle finger, and I just find that very very bold, but quite hilarious.
There were quite a few responses that kind of missed the point of some questions and just kind of like vented their own personal beliefs. A
Yeah,
lot of But yeah,
yeah,
in coming back to that first question, I like one more final thing I'd like to say about that
right.
first prompt is like the accessibility. A lot of people were like another common thing that was brought up in the responses was the reach it has, and
Yeah,
once again to compare that to traditional forms of activism, where you may be demonstrating or protesting in public, you're really confined to that area. You might make news. The demonstration and protest might make news, but this is rarely international news, and if it is, it's a much bigger deal. Whereas for digital activism, it could be anything, and you could have that message spread like it's limitless because every country, every person, like not every person, but there's millions, well, billions of people that use digital media,
yeah,
and so your message can potentially reach all those people that use it, and that's why people value um, digital media when it comes to activism because of its reach and it's like you can communicate a message to much more people while doing less effort. Not to
yeah.
say that there's no effort involved, but again, combining these two responses to that first prompt, it's the accessibility and the reach that give it the benefit over traditional media forms.
Yeah, I quickly want to jump in and say I think digital activism, what makes it sort of stand out from traditional activism is it's a universal language, and you can use some digital media tools to get points across to someone, or at least show approval to someone who doesn't even speak the same language as you. Of course, we both speak English, and that's a very popular language in the world. But you can use things like emojis or likes or hearts or anything on whatever social media platform you may be using in order just to approve of something or to say, something is good, something is bad. It's it's incredible how, yeah, just universal it is. Because if you try and do something similar with a traditional activism, sure, you can maybe like grab a piece of paper and like put a symbol on it or something. It is, of course, more effort, and it's not like if you go through a protest and you have like a love heart put on a big white piece of paper and you're going through the streets of Melbourne or something, chances are people aren't going to turn to you because you're not saying anything. You're not saying much because there's no words there. There's no controversy. If the news is going to focus on that stuff, they're going to focus on the most controversial thing to get people turning their heads. And two, if you are in Melbourne doing that sort of thing, you're probably just if you do happen to get on the news by some miracle of the imagination, you'll probably just be broadcast to, Australian audiences, people watching things like 7 News, 9 News. You're not going to be broadcast in Barcelona or something, for example. Like, that's just a shot in the dark. Whereas if you use social media, you might have a better shot.
And just to go back to what you mentioned about how universal digital media is in reaching people all across the world.
Yeah.
Something as simple as posting a picture of like a current event or like what people are
Mm.
demonstrating against, like anywhere in the world can spread, and that just reaches everyone because there's no like vagueness to it. It's just a direct message that people understand and will be notified about when they see that.
Oh, 100%. I actually have a friend who he lives in Hawaii. He posted a short video of a volcano erupting, I believe, in his area, and that got tens of thousands of likes on Twitter. It went everywhere. Just one video, I think it was like a 15-second long video, was enough for people to say, get the information. Oh, this is happening in Hawaii. That's horrendous. I feel bad for whoever's living there. That's all it takes. Just one picture, one video to say this is happening here. And I think that's incredible that we can have that kind of language and use that.
Yep. Just to move on to the second question, the second prompt that was listed in the survey. Um, I believe it was, do you think digital activism contributes to real world change and why not? It's interesting to note that despite what a lot of people like a lot of people have preconceptions about digital activism, and we've referred to it, I think, in the last episode, that people often refer to it as Slacktivism, and people perceive it to be a lazy form of activism that doesn't
Yeah.
really work, and it's just kind of a cop out.
Hmm.
But it's interesting to note that while this might be the stereotype and the preconception of digital activism and digital activists, there was only one outright negative response to this question that said it doesn't contribute to real world change.
Right.
The majority were either neutral or positive, and in fact, it was the rest of the responses, out of the 12 responses that were left over, besides the negative one, 10 of those were outright positive. So there were only two that took like a sort of in the middle neutral stance.
Yeah, I can see that. There's one question here again from the 28th of June at 6:30 p.m., even the same time as the last prompt that I brought up. So this is probably the same person who says that they hate SJWs. They in response to, do you think digital activism contributes to real world change? Why/why not? They said yes, but not for the better, which is a really interesting point. Because of course that brings into question, of course, Slacktivism, and we're going to cover what that really is and the myths surrounding it in a future episode. Oh God, I'm so sorry. I keep bringing up the future episodes. I've got to keep you guys interested, okay? You gotta like and subscribe. No, I'm sorry. But the point I wanted to bring up here is they do agree that yes, digital activism does contribute to real world change, and they're saying it's it has more of a negative effect, which is pretty interesting. Like, if I could find out who this person is, I would like to sit and interview them and say, hey, why do you think this way exactly? Could you elaborate on why you think it's more of a negative change rather than a positive one? Because of course, there's lots, like, no activism is perfect. There's going to be mistakes. There's going to be people who are doing this for the wrong reasons, or doing it for the right reasons but have the incorrect execution, and then end up with a pretty horrible turn of events or horrible results in whatever they're trying to do. Um, I think I'm trying to figure out what they mean. I think they're sort of talking about, people getting together to uh, try and, for example, go out and storm the Capitol building. I think we can both agree that that was a pretty horrible incident on, I think it was the 6th of January, 2021. I think a lot of that was sort of inspired and riled on by digital activism. A lot of people got on boards and got together to say, hey, listen, let's go do this on this date. So that
Well,
could be what they're alluding to.
it's also interesting to note that the one negative response was given, like the one outright negative was, I believe it was mentioned that they believe that digital activism contributes more to people gaining like quote unquote superficial knowledge on issues, but doesn't contribute to any real world change. So
Right.
that can sort of relate to the other one. But like like I said, like you mentioned, it's interesting that he does believe that digital activism, or he or she or they, whoever answered this question, does believe that digital activism does contribute to real world change, but does it not for the better, but for the worse. It's interesting, and you'd have to wonder what kind of beliefs they'd have about how that change is affected.
Right.
So to move on to the third and final question, the prompt listed was, how do you think digital activism can be improved? And this was the one that received the most differing responses. Like there were really only like one or two responses that like were kind of the same, but everyone had like sort of a different solution or a different idea on how to fix digital activism. And just to go through some of these responses, just to summarize them. Um, there were people who believed that digital activism should have more emphasis on promoting real-world actions such as demonstrations, which is interesting because a lot of the research we've done has mentioned that activism is most effective when it is encouraging real-world demonstrations and real-world practical protests. So it's interesting that they sort of had that like same conclusion that we had as a result of the research. Um, there were also people who believe there was also a person who believed more policing should be done on social media platforms to stop the spread of false/misleading information as well as hate speech, which is interesting because again going back to the research, there was one article we looked at where certain digital activism activists viewed misleading and outright false information as the biggest threat to activist potential.
Yeah.
So that it sort of makes sense why someone would believe that there should be more emphasis on social media platforms to police that. Um, and we could also see in I think it was the Brexit campaign where there was an ad posted on Facebook that was I think it was promoting Brexit, promoting people to vote to leave, and
Yeah.
I think that ad was outright false, like in some of its points, but it was still like seen by millions of people and possibly influenced a lot of people to vote leave in that campaign. So it's interesting that that false post had an effect and such an influence, like possibly on the campaign.
Yeah, I know exactly what you were talking about. It sort of took me a second to read what you were sort of going into there, but I remember seeing, I think it was a TED talk on that from another class I did. If I can find the TED talk after this podcast, I will leave a link to it or maybe put the video on screen for a few seconds for our YouTube videos, YouTube viewers, of course. Sorry, SoundCloud viewers, you might have to suffer in the world of audio only listening. But yeah, no, that false ad was borderline propaganda from what I remember. Just spreading, completely biased, slanted information as fact, and influencing people's, voting choices, political choices. It was very, very scary, because I think I think that the way the TED Talk sort of framed it was that, uh, not to, well, in the nicest way possible. Facebook users, sorry, were sort of classed as of lower IQ, or just had less sort of consideration or knowledge of exactly what sort of content they were viewing and why it was being sort of sent to them, which I think is a pretty big dilemma of just social media usage in general. A lot of people don't have that awareness of why they're seeing this ad or why they're getting recommended to follow this person. And I think, of course, there are ways to look into that and to research it, but I think there should be more user-friendly ways for people to have access to that data and understand exactly what is going on behind the curtains, essentially.
Yeah, and taking all that into consideration, it makes sense why someone would believe that social media platforms would need to do more to stop these like false or misleading or biased posts that influence people who may not be informed on the issues and may not do any like other research and may just take the post at face value and just believe what they read. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, an interesting point that was also brought up as in response to that third prompt was someone believed that there should be more like more reduction of the barrier that older generations face when using digital media, and that's sort
Yeah.
of an interesting point that you don't think of often. Like you think of social media and digital media as like everyone's on the internet these days, everyone's using social media, but there is like more of a barrier that older generations face because they just didn't grow up with the same resources and same tools that and the same environment that we grew up in, where we're immediately exposed to the internet and immediately exposed to social media. So we've known it all our lives and we know how to work around it. But for
Hmm.
a lot of people, it is a new thing to them, and it makes sense that there'd be more of a barrier for them to face when trying to learn how to use these tools. So it's sort of something you don't think about often.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that point up because it actually relates directly to a tangent that I wanted to go on before we start wrapping things up. Of course, it's really easy to sort of just sort of stick into your own sort of generational perspective and not understand what it's like to be the the older person, and vice versa. If you're an older person, you're probably not going to understand what it's like to be a younger person, even though you were a younger person once. You got to remember you were in a different time. But leading on from this. Um, yeah, I want to just quickly relate this back to the Youth Justice Coalition and Fierce as well, and why these organizations were mostly youth-led. And I feel it's because these organizations, had the inspiration of Web 2.0 to, use multimedia strategy, use those emails, videotapes, video stories to propagate a message. And of course, that kind of technology is going to be favored towards younger people because, as you said, Spencer, we've been growing up with that sort of stuff our entire lives. If you're like, say, 35, 40 years old in the year 2003 when the Youth Justice Coalition was formed, you've been using things like newspaper, radio, TV for many, many years. And for you, that's always worked. So what's the point of adapting something new, And naturally, you're going to just think, oh, it's obviously marketed towards the kids, because they're going to grow up and they're going to know what's in front of them as the only option that's out there, which in most cases is true. I feel like, but yeah, if you are of that age, obviously you're not going to be on board with these kind of organizations because it's they're dealing in a very sort of they're on shaky grounds in the sense of they're working with a medium that's very experimental in that era. Of course, if you're like a financial advisor or some big suit at an institution or something, and some startup organization comes to you and asks for funding for resources, equipment, whatever it may be, you're going to consider, exactly what's what are they doing to accomplish their mission. And if they're just doing it through things like digital media, especially back in the early 2000s, you're going to think, well, hang on, that's pretty risky, because a lot of people aren't on board with that stuff. They don't understand it. And because it's mostly the youth that's clouding around this sort of thing, that's like the youth is sort of a minority in a way because it's like that's a pretty small percentage of people. And of course, not all the youth is going to be focused on digital media, especially not back then either, when we didn't have smartphones or anything. Because of course now you can buy a smartphone pretty much anywhere. So we're growing up in a world now, especially in the last couple of years, where 2-year-olds are going around with iPhones. Babies are born with smartphones in their hand, which of course, you know, can be a good or a bad thing. It really depends on your perspective. Um, but yeah, I think what something else that also kept older people away from these multimedia strategies is the sort of rebellion behind it. I think taking what's sort of considered back then as alternative media and using it to take on traditional media and take on the rest of the world. That's a big ask, and there's like if you're someone who's you know grown up, like as I said before, with TV and radio all this time, you're going to think, well, that's always worked in our society. I'm just going to stick with that. But if you're younger and you prefer getting a film camera or a video camera out and recording your friends saying something and putting it on the internet, you know that's more of a sort of against the grain sort of take. I don't know. What do you think, Spencer?
I mean, I think there's always been opposition to new forms of media. I forget the philosopher, but I think there was a Greek philosopher who was like opposed to books when they were first coming out because he thought they made people dumber. And
Yeah.
and and the same sort of thing to TV and radio when they were first coming out. There's always like the older generation kind of looking down on new forms of media because Possibly because it's just something new that they can't understand, and they've always done things one way. So it only makes sense that they believe that the one way they've done it makes the most sense and is the most reliable way of doing things. Like having something new prop up is hard to understand and hard to get to get a hold of and get your head around. So it makes sense sort of why like older generations would be sort of like opposed to new forms of media and the such.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I agree with that. I think it's about time we should wrap up the episode. This is normally the point where I tell you about what's going to be in the next episode, but if you've listened to this entire episode, you know exactly what's going on. But I will say, next episode will be more focused on some more modern examples of digital acts, and maybe some of the more effective examples, organizations or services actually getting funding from institutions to, carry out whatever project they're working on. But I think just focusing on this episode right now, I think we're pretty happy with what we've discussed. It's definitely mind blowing to see how influential organizations like the YJC and Fierce were all the way back then in the early to mid 2000s. It's incredible that these organizations use such a new alternative media to get so far and even still exist to this day. And I think adopting those sort of alternative media strategies all the way back then allowed them to survive for so long and become sort of the new beasts that they are today. What do you think, Spencer? What are some of the most interesting things we discussed today?
Well, the looking through the survey was most interesting to me. That's why I suggest like I asked, do you want me to look into and
Right.
analyze the results? Because I'm always interested in sort of like picking apart like the data of what we've investigated and like hearing what people have to say. So it was very interesting that there were so many different ideas and different opinions on how social media can be improved from people thinking it needed more support from big corporations to like we discussed earlier about older generations facing more of a barrier to utilizing and accessing social media. It's very very interesting. And even that the guy who was upset about the SJWs, I think he had another answer to another question. I think
Oh,
that
really?
third question, I think the third question, he was the one who wrote the one about like there should be more free speech to protect us against feminists and other fascists. So it was very funny to read that.
I just read
But
I just read that one. I didn't even notice that going through the results. That's amazing.
yeah, so there were a lot of different ideas and maybe some of them weren't as valuable or took the question as seriously, but they were all interesting to sort of
Yeah.
get to just to see how people have such different perspectives on social media and digital media and how it can be resolved. It's very interesting to me.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. There's always going to be tons of different perspectives and opinions on this sort of thing, especially since even now, even with the giants that social media, has become, there's still going to be people are still going to have their doubts about it, no matter how big it gets. But um, who knows? Maybe it's going to be even bigger in the next 10, 20, 30 years. I guess time will tell. Um,
Exactly.
but I think that's everything for today. Thank you everyone for watching. Of course, we're available on YouTube and on SoundCloud. You can find us both here and there. And if there's any extra reading that you guys want to check out, I would have probably put some stuff on screen in the YouTube video or in the description of the YouTube video. So if you definitely want to read up on some of the stuff we talked about, I will provide as many available links as we can. But yeah, is there anything you want to say before we head off, Spencer?
No, I think you wrapped it up fine. I think yeah, a very good discussion. Much more. I feel like last episode if we were to use a hamburger analysis, that was the bread, and now we're starting to get into the meat of the discussion and the investigation we have on this sort of topic.
Yes, indeed. I definitely agree with you there, mate. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Take care and goodbye.